Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Looks like the schedule is heating back up, my friends. I'm back on the road starting next month. I'm going to Milwaukee, September the 8th. I've got 2 dates in Chicago on September the 9th. I'm in Minneapolis-St. Paul on September 23rd. I've got a couple of dates for Florida. I'll be in Clearwater and Orlando the second weekend in November. And there's a chance I might be going to the Netherlands on November the 3rd for a convention. So the details I do have on these dates and events are at sethandrews.net, and you can just click the speaking tab, or you can check it out at thethinkingatheist.com/events. And it's the usual thing. I'll bring out a high-impact presentation. We'll get a chance to hang out, enjoy each other's company. And these are going to be big fun. So I hope to see you out there on the road here as we get set to wrap up the summer and get into the fall of 2018. Today's show is a thick little conversation, my friends. And I know it's not always going to be easy, and I know it's going to be frustrating and numbing and maddening at times, but I would encourage you to stick with it, even if you have to listen in segments, because there's so much good material here. As I spoke with a very special guest. Actually, we had this conversation at the end of July because our schedules are so wild. We're going to get political, and we're going to talk a lot about how religion is infecting the whole damn thing. Joining me for the broadcast is friend and activist and attorney Andrew Torrez. He is co-host of the Opening Arguments podcast. Andrew, it's great to have you.
Oh, Seth, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Do you have this challenge that we try to talk about other stuff? We talk about all of the myriad of things that come at us as activists, and yet time and time and time again, the conversation seems to be getting forced back into Trumpville. And I worry that it drives the listeners crazy, because I don't want to produce a show that drives the listeners crazy. But do you feel me, Andrew?
Oh, my God. Not only do I feel you, this is my challenge from week to week, right? So I do a show about stories in the news that have a legal component. And in the age of Trump, that means Trump stories, right? And I don't want to be doing a funereal death march every week. I can't have people listening to the show and then, bummed out every single time. But at the same time, you can't just talk about things in the abstract and pretend that there isn't an elephant in the room, because there's an elephant in the room. So yeah, this is my biggest challenge.
I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the culture of atheists and atheist activists and people who are humanists in general, I have noticed a trend, and I'll take it in the teeth for saying this out loud, that most of them that I've met lean left, right? They are liberal on issues like the right of a woman to choose, and they're anti-death penalty, and they don't want to jail people for weed, and they think sex is a beautiful thing, and as long as you're not hurting anybody else, knock yourself out, who cares, And so while you've got the hyper-evangelical types so often congregating in the GOP, a lot of the atheists and activists that I know in my life, they just seem to lean left. Has that been your experience?
I think that's right. And I am constantly disappointing all of my friends across the political spectrum, right? So to my right of center and conservative friends, I'm the crazy fringe leftist. And to
you secular hippie.
Right. And to the liberals who listen to the show, I'm insufficiently left and too conciliatory to trying to find common ground. Look, I think there are 2 reasons for that, right? So number one is, since 1970, right? Since Jerry Falwell and the moral majority movement, you have had the explicit design of co-opting religious conservatives, right? Religious fundamentalists under the rubric of a single Republican Party. And number two, that many of the key culture warrior Republican Party issues are things that only have a religious justification, right? So for example, like you can have a nuanced position on abortion, right? But the only people that think a 2-day-old blastocyst, that think, that the morning after pill is murder, the only way you can come to that conclusion is if you have a religious belief, right? The only way that you can care about, what 2 people do or 3 people do or whatever, however many number of consenting adults do in the privacy of their bedroom is from a religious belief. So, I get that it breaks down. You have the weird Ayn Randians kind of, libertarian, but yeah.
You're going to get hate mail for saying weird Ayn Randians. Because,
I welcome it. openarguments@gmail.com. Go for it.
When I was first an atheist activist, and I hadn't really gotten much into Rand's stuff, but there was a quote that happened to be factually, in my mind, factually true, or at least philosophically true, and I wasn't hugely aware of the rest of her work. And so I'd posted the quote, and it was weird because the seas parted. You saw the faithful, and then you saw the people who were like, what the hell is wrong with you? And that argument continues today. Have
you read any Robert Heinlein?
I have not.
Okay. So he's kind of a neo Ayn Randian, right? Like he's a fringe, and I think fans of his would agree, and I like some of his writing. He was a 1950s era. He lived through to 1987, 88, something like that. And so he endorsed a lot of the Randian ideas. He wrote a book called a science fiction future speculative novel called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, right? And it's about a Randian libertarian paradise on the moon, which is being used as a Australian style penal colony. And he was sort of, and it's got this delightful kind of tongue-in-cheek quality to it. He was far more self-aware than Rand ever was. Like I get the sense that Ayn Rand was just this sort of humorless, Oh man, I'm sorry. I'm going to kill you.
You are going to get more hate mail. It's okay.
I'll stop. But seriously, read Moon is a Harsh Mistress and then tell me that his criticisms aren't dead on. And this is on your own side, guys. Come on.
Back to what we were speaking about originally, the sort of host fatigue and listener fatigue. I wanted said here at the outset that I don't do this show. We're not doing this show, this conversation, you and me, Andrew, because we're enjoying ourselves. We're doing it because we feel it's critical and necessary. This is not a happy experience for us. It is something we feel must be addressed. Responsible activists and hosts and everyday people doing everyday things must be involved. They must be aware and they must engage to help prevent the evangelicals from taking a further hold or a greater hold in what is a church-state separated government. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly correct. And, this was something that I was talking to people about during 2016, during the election, because some people in the middle, some people in our community, secular people, were saying, oh, come on, it's Donald Trump, right? This is not, this is a lifelong New Yorker. Do you really think he hates gays? Do you really think, right? And that rhetoric was sort of really kind of strong in the back channel. And my point then, which I think is borne out in spades today, is if you look at the demographic breakdown of Trump supporters, right, he is underwater. He is strongly disapproved in every subsection that you can envision in American political life, except evangelical Christian voters. And among evangelical Christians, his approval rating is 90 in the mid 90s, right? 93, 94, 95%, off the charts. And so it should not be surprising for somebody who is solely concerned with maintaining his position in power, being reelected, all of those sorts of things, that what he's going to do are the things that placate his base, right? That's it. Those are the only people left that support Donald Trump, and they support him overwhelmingly. And so do I know what's going on in Donald Trump's head about gay marriage? I don't know, and I don't care. What I know is that the people that keep him in office and the people that keep him exerting pressure in Idaho, Wyoming, like that's the religious right, and he's going to continue to do, whatever makes them happy. And that's where we have to shore up our flank, and that's where we have to fight our holding actions. And that's not what I expected to be doing in this presidential administration. Like, I thought that my show would be, attacking Hillary Clinton often, from the left of being, overly, but we got to work with the facts on the ground as we find them, I guess.
Andrew Torrez, let's talk about the Johnson Amendment first. I know that, and you can frame this, but didn't Trump sort of issue some sort of was it an executive order where he had signed some mostly ceremonial? There was an act that said, we want to repeal the Johnson Amendment. Let's talk about what the amendment is, why it's important, and why we need to fight to prevent its repeal.
Yeah, there are a bunch of things to unpack here, right? So first, what is the Johnson Amendment? The Johnson Amendment was passed by then Congressman Lyndon Johnson, right, in the 1950s. And what it does is it amends Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Service tax code, right? And essentially, the distinction is if there are different provisions of the tax code that provide that your dollars, your tax money is treated in different ways, right? So if you are a 501c3 charitable organization, right? That means you are a religious, educational, civic, social, charitable institution. And those institutions, not only do they operate on a tax-exempt basis, but your contributions to those organizations are tax deductible. Right? So when you give money to a 501c3 group, you get to deduct the money that you've given from your taxes as a charitable contribution. That's what we think of as charitable organizations. There is also the 501c4 classification. And that 501c4 classification applies to organizations that conduct political lobbying. And so you may have seen this before, but like if you give money to Planned Parenthood, right, you can give money to Planned Parenthood as a 501c3, and that will be used to help low-income women get needed breast screening exams, that sort of thing. For lobbying on the kinds of causes that Planned Parenthood cares about, they form a separate 501c4 called Planned Parenthood Action. And that group, the difference between a 3 and a 4 is that while the organization is still tax exempt, your contributions to Planned Parenthood Action, your contributions to a political lobbying group are not tax deductible. And think about what it means for something to be tax deductible. That means we're subsidizing that from the general pool of tax revenue, right? And so that brings us back full circle. Lyndon Johnson, his thought process was, hey, if you are a church, if you are presumptively tax exempt, that's great. And we're going to continue that. But in exchange for being presumptively tax exempt, you got to keep your nose out of politics. That's it. And I can tell you that when you are a 501c3 corporation, and I have clients that do this, I'm a practicing lawyer, and we went through the application process. The biggest thing that any charitable 501c3 organization goes through is making sure they comply with the IRS guidelines and say, hey, look, we're not doing any political lobbying. We're not doing anything of the sort because we don't want to transgress this boundary. And now we want to blow up the boundary. So I'm sorry. I know that was like super long. But,
no, I appreciate
but
it.
That's the history. Yeah.
And I wanted to interject, if I may. It looks like the double standard firmly in place when it comes to churches who do actually lobby and who preach to their congregants as to how to vote, many of them passing out voter guides. Those types of things seem to be a direct violation, correct?
Yeah. And and now we come around to the executive order, right? So from a practical perspective, there is a single employee at the Department of Internal Revenue who is charged with policing religious 501c3s and bringing an IRS investigation when that religious 501c3 transgresses the line, violates the terms of the Johnson Amendment. As it turns out, that office has been vacant since the George W. Bush administration, right? Yeah. So yeah, this is not a well-enforced doctrine, and churches, I mean, you've talked about this on your show, right? Like churches have freedom from the pulpit Sunday, right? Like I think I'm botching exactly what they call that name, where, these right-wing evangelical megachurch pastors will deliver overtly political sermons and tape themselves and send it into the IRS and sort of be like, we dare you to audit us. And those pulpit freedom Sundays have been going on for 15 years. So the current conditions are not great, but the difference is, it's the difference between having a law on the books that, the enforcement can come and go versus not having that law on the books and having to pass another law again. And so I get it, right? Like the holding action on saying, let's make sure they don't repeal the Johnson Amendment. Like if they don't repeal the Johnson Amendment, the executive order was described what the Trump Department of Justice is going to do with respect to churches that violate it. And basically that answer was, we're going to do nothing. But at least the law is there. At least the infrastructure and the mechanism is there such that in the future, maybe there's something we can do, as opposed to changing the structural conditions so that when a Democrat is elected, when somebody that cares about having secular government is back in government, then the question is, what tools have we empowered that person with to act? And if we take away those tools, then you have to rebuild from the ground up, right? And I don't know, right? Like the Johnson Amendment passed overwhelmingly in the 1950s, right? Like that was not a controversial proposition that churches who get tax benefits should stay out of politics. I don't know that would pass today. I don't know that would pass under a Democratic president with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House of Representatives, right? So is the Johnson Amendment genuinely under threat? So I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, partisanship is so high that it would be a challenge to imagine Democrats lining up and voting to give Donald Trump a victory on anything. If you want to play it safe, go that way and say Republicans don't have close to 60 votes. It's not going to pass. Don't worry about it. And I would often say that. On the other hand, when you're looking at a number of vulnerable Democrats in the 2018 midterm elections who are Democratic senators from deeply red states, right? Like Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota and Joe Donnelly in Indiana, telling him to vote against freedom for churches is, it's a tough spot to put those elected officials in. And so, I don't want to say that I think it can't get 60 votes in the Senate. I hope it doesn't. I wouldn't bet that it would, but I wouldn't ease my foot up on the throttle, right? Like I would call my senator and say, the separation of church and state is important to me. And, I think we should maintain the current structure. And remember, the only thing, and this is part of what the pulpit freedom people are hoping you miss, right, is the difference between if you want to be a church and you want to lobby the government, all you have to do is start a 501c4. All you have to do is start a subsidiary organization the way liberal groups have done, right, like Planned Parenthood Action. And the only difference is you don't get tax subsidized for those contributions, right? You're still a tax exempt organization. You can still lobby. You can still do anything you want. But when people give you money, they can't deduct it from their taxes. They can't take it out of the public treasury to pay for public lobbying. And I think that's a good balance. And I think that's a good balance regardless of where you are on this side of the issue. But, I'm a notorious optimist. So
talking with Andrew Torrez. He is co-host of the Opening Arguments podcast. So we lost Kennedy on the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. How terrified should we be? So there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. Number one is that Anthony Kennedy has been
the swing vote on the Supreme Court for the past 10 years. And so it's our natural tendency to say, okay, that means he's a moderate. That means he's in the middle. And all it means is he's in the middle when you line up the justices 1 through 9, right? Like if you if you start with the most liberal, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and you go to the most conservative, Neil Gorsuch, the middle vote is Anthony Kennedy. But that doesn't mean like on a scale of 0 to 100 that he's a 50, right? Like I would say on a scale of 0 to 100, he's probably a 75, right? Like he is a mainstream conservative who is pro gay rights and has cast, right? He was the deciding vote in the Obergefell decision that legalized marriage equality in this country. He has been a consistent vote for LGBTQ rights up until this past term. But that doesn't mean that he's a moderate in the sense that you or I might typically use the word, right? Like somebody who's sort of right on the border as between the Democratic and Republican parties. He's a mainstream conservative. With Kennedy's retirement, if you're doing the median, right? I don't mean to do too much math lesson here, but if you want to go to justice number 5, if you replace Anthony Kennedy with Brett Kavanaugh, then the median justice on the Supreme Court will be John Roberts, who is probably a 92, 93, right? Like who is significantly to the right of almost everybody who has been on the Supreme Court. And the only reason that he's now the, quote, swing justice is because everybody to his right is an ideological partisan, right? Like is Alito, Gorsuch, Clarence Thomas, and now I think likely Brett Kavanaugh. So it materially is going to move the Supreme Court significantly to the right. And we've had periods in American history where, it's been 20, 30 years at a clip, and the Supreme Court has been politically out of step with where the country is. So, and I think that's where we're headed.
I know that when I was a devout Christian, my objections to Roe v. Wade were religious. They were rooted in my belief that a soul had been created at the moment of conception. We fight for the unborn because they cannot fight for themselves. And this narrative continues here in the 21st century. And I know that many of the objections to Roe v. Wade are rooted themselves in evangelical and fundamental Christianity. How in danger are we of seeing Roe v. Wade affected by this shift in the court?
Roe v. Wade is the sort of flashpoint for the Kavanaugh nomination. Let me talk a little bit about the history of the decision and what's happened to this point to tell you what I think is going to happen next, right? So Roe v. Wade, 1973, came out with what I think is a completely sensible approach to the question of abortion. And the Supreme Court said, look, we understand that we value as a fundamental right inherent in the Constitution the notion of what the court called privacy. And it's a totally weird word. It's anachronistic these days because when you and I say the word privacy, we think, pulling the shower curtain back when somebody walks into the bathroom accidentally, right? Like this is, don't look at, right? This is a private moment. But what the Supreme Court meant by that was what we might call autonomy. The idea that in personal decisions, individuals ought to enjoy the freedom to make up their own minds in a free society, right? And they ought to enjoy that in particular over things like sex, marriage, relationship, procreation, all of those things. And there's a long line of cases prior to Roe v. Wade. And in Roe v. Wade, what the court decided, and Roe v. Wade was a 7-2 decision, right? Like this was not a 5-4 skin of the teeth. It was not a controversial opinion among Supreme Court justices at the time. What Roe v. Wade said was basically, look, you've got two different potential legal interests here. You have the interest of the state in protecting future potential human life, right, of its citizens, and you have the interest of the woman in bodily autonomy and what they called privacy, of making her own choices. And so the court said, you know what? This is really, really difficult to decide, and lots of people of goodwill come out lots of different ways. And so what we're going to do is we're going to split this into a 3-part system, the trimester approach, right? And we're going to say, so in the first trimester, in the first 3 months, and I know that doesn't quite line up with months, but, cut me a little bit of slack. This is what the Supreme Court said.
We got you.
Right?
Yeah, we got you.
So first 3 months, the woman's liberty interest is paramount. And so the state cannot regulate, restrict, prevent her from exercising her right to an abortion, which is inherent in the concept of ordered liberty in that first 3 months. In the middle 3 months, the state can restrict but not prohibit. And in the last 3 months, the states can prohibit. And that was the system that Roe v. Wade put into place in 1973. And I have to tell you, I think that's a better system than what we have now, right? I think that balances out the interests and it recognizes across the spectrum. Yes, there are some people that believe very strongly in the state's interest in preserving potential human life. And it says, here's how we weigh. We recognize that. Here's how we weigh it out. What happened was in 1992, with a more conservative Supreme Court, conservatives took another whack at Roe v. Wade, and they'd hated it since the decision came out. And in the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the more conservative Rehnquist-era court reaffirmed the central holding of Roe. They said, look, there is a woman's right to bodily autonomy inherent in the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution, but we're going to get rid of the trimester approach and we're going to replace it with what Sandra Day O'Connor, who drafted that opinion, said is an undue burden test. And so government cannot unduly burden a woman's right to seek an abortion under the Constitution. But notice that by doing that, by abolishing the trimester approach, that now meant that states were free to impose restrictions on first trimester abortions on the day after day 2 abortions. And that approach is what's presently the law. So where all of the activism has been for the past 25 years has been on the right political right side of the spectrum in terms of restricting a woman's right to choose based on putting certain criteria in place that those groups, those states were then prepared to go into court and say, well, this doesn't constitute an undue burden. And so that you get things like a woman has to have an ultrasound before she can get an abortion. She has to have a 3-day waiting period in which she's exposed to various literature, almost all of which is written by the extreme right, before she can get an abortion. All of these things that are now eating away at the core right that was enshrined in Roe. What I think is going to happen, right, building on what I said previously, the idea that John Roberts is going to be the swing vote, I don't think John Roberts wants to overturn a 45-year-old opinion and say, nope, we were wrong in Roe v. Wade. It's not good law. We're going to send that back. We're going to declare that there is no right to an abortion inherent in the Constitution. I don't think he wants to say that. I think you were going to have 4 votes. You were going to have Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh who will vote to do that. I think Roberts is going to side with the court's left wing and author an opinion that continues the path set by Planned Parenthood versus Casey that says we reaffirm Roe v. Wade, but we're going to gut a lot of the holding. And I think it's going to reduce that undue burden test and it's going to pave the way for a tremendous amount of restrictions, regulations, spousal consent laws, things like that. That's where I think we're headed on abortion.
Just a quick sort of a digression. I mean, we're still talking about the Supreme Court, but I just want real fast your opinion. It's funny, when Souter's name had come up, I want to say he was under Bush 1.
Yeah.
When did Souter come up? And then Roberts was in 2004 or 5, something like that, which was W, if I recall.
Yeah.
And everybody was like, oh, conservative, conservative, conservative. And then once they took their chair, once they became part of the Supreme Court, they actually ended up being a bit more moderate, a bit less conservative than many on the right had expected or even hoped they might be. Do I perceive that wrong? Did you feel any of that whenever, they finally were confirmed?
I think that's super perceptive. And this is really my hobby horse. And I'm the only person that I know of that's making this argument. So I'm glad you're giving me a platform to make it here.
All right.
When Souter was nominated by George H.W. Bush in his sole term in 1991, I believe, liberal interest groups opposed David Souter. And they did so on the basis he was I believe he was on the Supreme Court of New Hampshire, and he had ruled in a number of ways that suggested to liberals that he was a conservative by temperament. But the difference, and I think that was correct, right? Like I think he was politically minded, a right of center guy. But the difference between a David Souter and a Neil Gorsuch, for example, is what we call jurisprudence. And it's not about the result that you reach, but it's about the mental process that you use to get there. And this is my hobby horse. And again, it's my hobby horse because I'm a lawyer and I care about law geekery stuff like this. But lawyers, left, right, and center, abide by the overwhelming majority, 80, 90% of lawyers, when you ask them, how do you know what the law is? They will abide by what I call the ordinary model of jurisprudence. And what that means is that when you look at the Constitution, you get certain phrases in the Constitution that are very clearly meant to be general principles of what I would call, moral principles, right? So look through the Constitution, right? The Fifth Amendment says no person may be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, I could ask you, like, what's a process and how much of it are you due, right? Right? The Eighth Amendment says no cruel and unusual punishment shall be inflicted, right? Well, what's cruel and unusual punishment? And the ordinary method of jurisprudence says we look at that as enshrining a principle that says, so when the Eighth Amendment says you shall not have cruel and unusual punishment, that means, boy, things that shock the conscience, things that strike us as, that seems like torture. That seems wrong. That seems offensive to the conscience. That's the kind of thing that the Constitution was meant to prohibit. And the way in which you interpret that from 1789 all the way to the present is by a string of prior decisions of the Supreme Court. And that principle is a Latin term called stare decisis, right? It means let the prior decision stand. And so what you do is, and this is how everybody who goes to law school learns the law, you look at it and you go, okay, I'm applying this principle in this circumstance and the court is coming up with this rule. And then a subsequent Supreme Court comes along and says, okay, we've previously looked at it and we applied the rule in this way and we came out to this result. And that's how, until 1987, and I'm not making this up, everybody did law who sat on the Supreme Court. And in 1987, the Republican Ronald Reagan tried to nominate Bork to the Supreme Court, right? And Joe Biden, then chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, led a very successful effort to convince the American public not that Bork was not intelligent. He was fiercely intelligent. He was absolutely, if you organize by IQ, by, law school degree, whatever, he was qualified in that sense to serve on the Supreme Court. But what Biden said was his judicial philosophy is not in lockstep with the Constitution. And not only did a majority of the American people agree, but Republicans in the Senate, Mac Mathias from Maryland, Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania. There are others, but those were on the Judiciary Committee, and those are the ones I can remember off the top of my head. Republicans said, no, we can't vote to confirm this guy. He's too far outside the mainstream. And Bork went down.
I remember as an evangelical conservative, it became a verb, right?
Yeah.
Because whenever someone was disconfirmed, we'd just say they got borked.
Yeah. What it meant to get borked was the fact that Bork had a long history of writing things like Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided. The U.S. Congress should not have passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? Like things that are broadly unacceptable to a mainstream of Americans. So, he was borked with his own words, right? Like I watched
What a
that.
great word.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to integrate that into other conversations.
And what an epic beard too, right?
Yeah.
Bird living in that.
If you're good for time, Andrew Torrez, I'd like to take a short break and come back and talk about the FBI investigation, the Mueller investigation that's been going on. If you hear the pundits talk about it, it's been going on since the earth cooled and dinosaurs roamed the earth. But let's get some perspective on, the FBI, why the investigation matters, how it affects us. And are you good to get into those very deep waters in just a few?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'll be right back. Hang on. In a world where it seems like everything and everybody are on camera, our own phones are tracking devices, recording devices, our cars document every drive, advertisers track our movements, the internet never forgets. Do we as American citizens have any expectation of privacy? And should we? How much concern should the surveillance age cause us? How much should law enforcement and government know about what we do and who we're with and what we own? Especially as people on all sides are waving the Constitution to support their positions. Well, I found Professor Jeffrey Rosen's lecture series on this hugely compelling. It is called Privacy, Property, and Free Speech, Law and the Constitution. It's at the Great Courses Plus. Rosen is a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School, and he covers really relevant stuff about the use and misuse of our information in the wake of things like the Patriot Act, the act that opens up private records for the interest of national security. It's so interesting. It's so relevant. And right now, for a limited time, my special URL gets you a free 30-day trial to the Great Courses Plus, so you can watch Professor Rosen's lecture or any one of over 10,000 other lectures for free for a month. The world's best professors right at your fingertips, talking about the things that interest you, from history to science, travel, sports, lessons on how to draw, so much more. Start your free month today. You will love it. Sign up at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. A reminder that my patrons get a commercial-free version of the broadcast, and they get the show 2 days early. They get it on Sundays instead of Tuesday, if that matters to you. And thanks so much for the support at patreon.com/Seth Andrews. I know that Andrew Torrez has his own broadcast, opening arguments. Do you guys do the Patreon thing or sponsor? I mean, how do you guys keep afloat over there?
We're patreon.com/law, and we do the show twice a week. Our Friday episode is a breaking news episode, which almost always means it's a Trump episode. And then our Tuesdays, we tend to do more deep dives into things that everybody thinks are true, but are not. If you like law geekery, give the show a shot. So, if you don't, then,
Law Geekery is another great podcast name. So it's patreon.com/law.
Yeah.
And I'll make sure and include the link to your podcast page in the description box, because I want people, as many people as possible, to find. You mentioned Trump. I got to go back to Trump. The Mueller probe, it's overwhelming, and so many people check out. Who's been indicted, and what charges have been brought, and what's fact, and what's assumed, and what are they still investigating, and when's this all going to be over with? And they just go, screw it. And then they check out and they go off and watch cat videos. And I really can't blame them, right? Because it's overwhelming. So because you are a professional communicator, I'm charging it to you. I'm begging you, Andrew Torrez, explain the Mueller investigation and why it matters.
All right. Well, so now I'm under the gun.
All right. Yeah.
A week into the Trump administration, Donald Trump broke the law. And he broke the law in an unambiguous way, right? He named his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to the White House staff. That is in violation of the anti-nepotism law, which was passed after JFK announced that Robert Kennedy would be his attorney general. And Republicans in Congress said, I'm sorry, we're not going to have presidents sticking their brothers into, this is not going to happen. You find somebody else, right? And it is, we have a joke and a hashtag on the show, which is hashtag clear as Kushner for instances where Donald Trump has violated the law in a way that is unambiguous and clear. And so all right, so we did that week one. And week two, after the Trump inauguration, people started emailing me to say, all right, so how do we impeach Donald Trump? Right. And he's committed a crime. The only remedy when a president commits a crime is impeachment. And so how do we impeach Donald Trump? And the answer I came up with kind of on the spot, maybe I would do better if given more prep work, but I did it on the spot. And here's what I came up with. You remember the old Price is Right? The old Bob Barker Price is Right. And they used to have, I think they still do, but Bob Barker did it the best, right? The mountain climber game. And the camera would zoom in on the little guy and the yodeling music would play in the background. And you had to guess the price of certain items. And every time you missed, right, it was like, how much is a bar of soap? And you would guess $2 and it was $4. And so the little yodeler, while they played this noise, would move 2 steps up the mountain. And the way they kept the tightness on the shot, you didn't know when you were watching The Price is Right when the yodeler was going to go over the cliff. But when the yodeler went over the cliff, that's when the competitor lost and you didn't get any prizes, right? And that's my analogy for what's it going to take to impeach Donald Trump. Every time he does something illegal, preposterous, stupid, ridiculous, it moves us a tiny notch up what I call Yodel Mountain. And the camera is tight in on him. We do not know how tall Yodel Mountain is, but eventually there's a peak. There's a point at which nobody can defend what's going on anymore. And we are hurtling towards the apex of Yodel Mountain. Now, the Mueller investigation. Robert Mueller was appointed actually by a friend of mine. Rod Rosenstein, right, the Deputy Attorney General. I am a practicing lawyer in Maryland. Rod Rosenstein is somebody I know very, very well. And when he was appointed, I went on and said, this person is a lifelong conservative Republican. We don't agree on anything politically, but he loves this country. He cares about the future of the United States. He's somebody you can trust to faithfully execute the law. And he appointed Bob Mueller, again, who is in that same vein. And so what I would say is that you want to keep in mind the following things. Number one, these people are all Republicans. So they are not, to expect them to share your political beliefs is wrong. Number two, a complex criminal investigation like this takes multiple years to unfold. And so the strategy of the pro-Trump arch right wing is to say, oh, well, Mueller's been at this for forever and he hasn't found anything yet. So clearly there's nothing there. It requires patience. It requires you to say, I know, I get it. I wish we were moving up 10 steps at a time up Yodel Mountain, but we're moving up 1 step at a time. And the way in which Mueller has conducted this investigation is consistent with what the best, smartest, most astute prosecutors would do. I can't tell you how good a job he's done. And you have to be patient and don't fall into the trap that the right wing wants you to fall into, right? Which is, okay, give me my results now.
So, you think we'll see something concrete before the midterms? I mean, that's huge.
So here's what I think is going to happen. We are recording this on Monday, July 23rd. On Wednesday, July 25th, Paul Manafort's trial in the Eastern District of Virginia begins, right? And Paul Manafort is as guilty as anybody has ever been. He has very clearly violated the tax laws. He has violated failure to register as the agent of a foreign principal while he was lobbying U.S. government on behalf of Ukraine. He's guilty. He's laundered $100 million. And there are, I believe, 32 outstanding criminal counts against Paul Manafort. Because of a weird procedural quirk that I'm not going to explain because no one cares about except me, in addition to this trial in the Eastern District of Virginia, he's got a trial in the District of Columbia that is pending in September. So the next 8 weeks are going to have in the background various elements of the Manafort trial coming to the fore. And by the time this airs, it's possible he will have cut a plea deal to flip on Donald Trump in exchange for lenient treatment. If that happens, all of this is not going to be valid. If he doesn't, if he continues with the trial, there is going to be this steady drip of information flowing out about the connections between Paul Manafort, Donald Trump, and Russia, and that's going to stay in the news. I do not expect that the Mueller investigation will issue a report before the midterms. I think that's going to come in December of this year. And I think part of the reason for that is because remember that there's some question about this, but I am on the side. Maybe losing my liberal cred here on the show. I'm on the side of people that say you can't indict a sitting president, right? Like you cannot get a prosecutor to go into the Oval Office and haul out Donald Trump in handcuffs. The only remedy is impeachment. And then when he's impeached, then you can indict him and then you can try him criminally. So Mueller's report is a report that is aimed politically at the House of Representatives. Are you going to impeach this guy for these crimes? And that report will differ whether it's a Republican-controlled House or a Democratic-controlled House. So I don't think Mueller is going to release a report before the midterms. I think he's going to wait, see what kind of House of Representatives he has, and then release a report that is tailored to that audience.
Andrew, I finished the book. I bought the book. It was one of I think he sold 600,000 copies in his first week. James Comey's book called A Higher Loyalty. And, he was fired as FBI director. I was curious. The book it's not great. I mean, it's kind of rah-rah. It's a typical politician's book I didn't learn anything new about Trump, except I was interested in his accounts of the meetings, the personal meetings. Now, the FBI is supposed to operate as an independent entity. I mean, the FBI doesn't really work for Trump. And yet Comey was sort of speaking about his meetings as if Trump had that expectation. Trump kept talking to him about, I want loyalty. Loyalty is important to me. And of course, the job of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is to be autonomous so that it can go in with dispassion and assess the evidence and pursue justice without having to worry about loyalty, except loyalty to the truth and to the United States of America. And I found that very interesting. I kind of think that Trump's a little bit like Nixon was in the Frost interview back in 1977, whenever Frost sort of pinned him. And Nixon said, it's not illegal when the president does it. I get the vibe that Trump's like, the FBI, it's not illegal if I demand its loyalty because I'm the man, I'm the president, I'm in the big chair. And he's sort of making up the rules. Does any of this strike you? Do you have any thoughts on any of this?
So let's travel back in time to 2016. In any objective observer's viewpoint, James Comey helped elect Donald Trump in 2016 in two ways, right? In late July, he released the first report along with a press conference regarding Hillary Clinton's emails. And while that decision was not to prosecute Hillary Clinton, and not to plug, but we had an episode of OA that went through and explained in great detail the basis therefore, right? Like there was absolutely no reason the statute under which they were talking about potentially prosecuting Hillary Clinton was designed for people who got classified intelligence and did things like accidentally left it in a desk after a drunken bender, true case, threw it into a dumpster and let kids find it while they were playing, true case, right? So, nothing in the law would have supported indicting Hillary Clinton. And so when Comey came out in July and said, we're not going to indict Hillary Clinton, but boy, was she grossly negligent in this, that cost Hillary Clinton about 8 points in the polls. And then in late October, 2 weeks before the election, Jim Comey came out and said, we have added as part of our investigation the emails associated with Anthony Weiner, whose wife, Huma Abedin, was one of Hillary Clinton's senior aides. And we don't know, right, because the polling takes a while for the lag to catch up. But that's not a helpful thing to do, 10 days out before an election.
Well, and he was anxious to sort of justify that in the book. I felt it was a weak justification. And
look, there's a lot of blame to go around, right? I give a speech in which, I am not kind to Jill Stein supporters, but, I'm not kind. My buddy Nate Silver, he and I used to work together on the old Baseball Prospectus days before he went off and founded 538. He had Wisconsin as a deep blue state. And so, how much of, Democratic apathy in Wisconsin staying home, made a difference in what I think was a 30,000 vote margin in that state. There's a lot of blame to go around. But my point is that it's worth remembering that before Donald Trump took office, Comey was excoriated on the left and was a hero on the right. right? He was no friend to Hillary Clinton in 2016. And the reason I think for this is because there's sort of a long-standing tradition, going back to J. Edgar Hoover, of the FBI attempting to maintain its independence and consolidate power. And I think Comey thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, and he wanted to bring her down a peg prior to the election. By the way, that is consistent with the joint intelligence report that was released in January of 2017. That was the FBI, NSA, CIA report that concluded that Russia meddled in our election, and that in October, Russia concluded that Hillary Clinton was going to win, so they were going to focus their efforts to bringing down her administration rather than trying to elect Donald Trump. So I think everybody thought that, and I think Comey thought that, and he thought, yeah, look, I'm not going to cost Hillary the presidency, but I want to make this close, and I want to make sure that she's accountable, and I want to, maintain my power base at the FBI. I certainly don't think he ever thought that was going to elect Donald Trump, but it contributed to that. So this is another thing that I've done on my show, right? So I have tried to moderate between vacillating from far left to far right. In October of 2016, it was, is Comey a traitor to the United States for bringing this issue up, right? And the answer is no. Right to, February of 2017, is he a shill and a plant trying to bring down the Trump administration from the inside? Neither of those are correct, right? Here's somebody I honestly believe here is somebody who is a lifelong public servant who has his view of the intelligence community, who was trying to consolidate power in the FBI. And boy, did he mess up, right? in releasing his reports during a presidential election, right? He guessed wrong. And I would hope that the lesson folks would take away from that is don't try and guess at how a presidential election is going to come out.
What I appreciate about your take on it is that it's not binary thinking. You and I in the Twitterverse, Comey's a hero or a villain. And, I think he's a tremendously flawed guy who also, I think, was genuinely doing what he felt was right. I mean, the more I read and learn about the guy, even though we disagree on a great many things politically, and I know he's moderated, he's distanced himself from the GOP, he's now telling Democrats how to vote.
Yep.
But, I think, this guy, I did come away with the opinion that he really did think he was doing the right thing. He just mucked it up.
Do you remember the name of the author who said, no one is the villain in their own story?
I don't know, but it's a great line.
I love that line, right? It's hard. And I'm, anybody who's been listening to the show, right? That I'm a left of center guy, but I try and go through this and I try and have the viewpoint of nobody thinks that they're the villain in their own story.
Well, I heard a great quote the other day that I actually find a lot of truth in it. And it said something like, we judge other people by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. Meaning that we're so much more forgiving whenever we screw up or whenever we act imperfectly because we had the best of intentions, but we're not nearly as charitable in many cases. And of course, the purists, again, are going to run off and find genuinely awful examples and say, what if, what about? But that's not what we're talking about. You and I probably agree. Comey's a flawed guy, but he wasn't trying to subvert the justice system. He genuinely was trying to do the right thing as head of the FBI.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. The philosopher, what you're reminding me of is the philosopher that is the most foundational to the formation of this country is John Locke, right? And his 2 treatises of government. And in his second treatise of government, he says, and I'm botching the quote a little bit, but he says, passion and revenge carry men too far and with too much heat in their own cases and not far enough in the cases of injustices of others. And I think that is the premise of, the notion of our shared social contract.
After the debacle of Scott Pruitt at the EPA. Now, he's from Oklahoma, right? So a lot of us saw this train coming because he's very wired in.
Did you know him before he was elevated? I mean, had you kind of watched that?
I knew of him. I mean, I'd never met Pruitt, but yeah, he was a legislator. He was a representative here in in the state of Oklahoma, my home state. And so whenever he was tapped for EPA, I was like, oh, God, and he finally ends up resigning. And we all shake our heads. And then I see some good news. Jim Bridenstine, who is another product of Oklahoma, ends up being appointed as the head of NASA. Now, you have to remember, many of us come out of this dominionist culture where we believe that the earth was given to us to have dominion over, and that Jesus is coming back in about 30 minutes anyway, so we can just have a kegger, we can trash the place. It's arrogant to think that humans can genuinely damage the planet in any meaningful way anyway. I mean, that's kind of how blasé many evangelicals are about our planet, about the environment, certainly about climate change. So Bridenstine goes up to head NASA, and they've got him in their offices for about 5 minutes, and he comes out and says, I now agree that human beings are responsible for climate change. And I thought, it's possible. Like, this is the good news that I needed this year. Did you follow that story at all?
I saw a little bit of that story, and part of it is because one of the things we try and do on the show is, debunk fake news on both sides of the aisle, right? And let me be clear, this is not a case where it's equally distributed. There is far more. There's no equivalent on the mainstream left of Hillary Clinton is raping, carving up babies and eating them in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that doesn't have a basement, right? Like that there's no equivalent of that, of the Pizzagate stuff, right? But there is, right? There's Occupy Democrat. There are terrible sources. I did this a couple weeks ago. There was an article about how, that written by a law professor at, I think, University of Louisiana. And I tweeted at him and I'm like, you're welcome to come on the show and engage. But you've argued that the Democrats should sue to keep Brett Kavanaugh off the bench on the theory that the McConnell rule used to run out the clock on Merrick Garland is law. And like, it was preposterous, right? Like, it was something so stupid that nobody, left, right, center, with a year's worth of law school could have possibly thought was sensible. So we try and police that. And one of the first fake news stories that came out on the left was that Donald Trump was gutting NASA and replacing their educational budget with, young earth creationism stuff, right? Because that plays into what we want to believe. And if I were to say that right now, if I were to say Donald Trump gutted the budget for NASA and replaced it with young earth creationists, you would find that plausible, right? Like my listeners, your listeners would find that plausible, right? Because it fits into the narrative. Yeah. Not true, right? It as it turns out, all the things that Donald Trump has done, and we're an hour into. I don't think anybody thinks either you or I are big Donald Trump fans. He increased the budget for NASA, not a lot, and the characterization of things, whether something's classified as educational or public interest, but increased the budget, didn't change the mandate, did not appoint young earth creationists, right? They didn't screw up NASA, right? And so, again, I'm going to proudly vote against Donald Trump in 2020. But I think it's important when we are discussing what he did to not fall prey to fake news, to false statements, because then when somebody is able to show us the facts, right, then we look wrong. Right. Like there are. Well,
and hyperbole helps no one. I'm struck by we, in our desire to try to emphasize the point, will often sort of truss up and inflate and assume and overstate. And, especially in the Twitterverse, once again, this is very easy to do. I'm not a Bridenstine fan.
Right.
But I think it's intellectually dishonest to look at I just saw the article on NASA's own website that said they posted his statement from 2013 as a climate change denialist. And then a statement from just a few weeks ago after only a month and a half as the head of NASA. And he comes forward and he says, I fully believe in climate change and that we human beings are contributing to it in a major way.
Yeah.
Well, I have to, as someone who is trying to be intellectually honest about this, I have to give him props and say he changed his mind when presented with the facts, with better information, and he should be congratulated and encouraged for that.
I totally agree. And so, to kind of bring it back to a case that's within our community, the Kitzmiller versus Dover decision in Pennsylvania, the U.S. District Court judge there was John Jones III, a George W. Bush appointee, a lifelong conservative, somebody that if you and I and Judge Jones sat together over beer, like, we're not going to agree with him on anything. But it was important that issue, that he didn't view that issue as, okay, if I'm liberal, then that means I'm anti-intelligent design. If I'm conservative, that means I'm pro-intelligent design. And that's what the ID folks wanted, right? Like both William Dembski and Michael Behe, both of them kind of live tweeted their involvement in the trial, and Behe was a witness, Dembski withdrew, but both of them sort of, live tweeted and live blogged about the trial. And both of them kind of had the view of, hey, look, like, we're in rural Pennsylvania. We got a Bush appointee as our judge. This is in the bag. And Jones said, no, I'm having none of this, right? Like, this is, you are attempting to spew nonsense in my courtroom, and get out. And I think the fact that case was competently litigated, and not litigated on the political grounds, litigated on the factual and legal grounds, like, helped us win in that. So I realize I'm diverting onto another branch, but yeah, like,
I think we're speaking to seeing people and circumstances in three dimensions and fairly, and trying to reject this sort of binary approach. You have to be just like me. You have to approach it and think just like me. Or else we're enemies, kind of thing.
Yeah. So let me ask you this question, right? Because you are involved in public communication, and I struggle with this all the time. And it's the question that Lawrence Krauss, before he made it onto sort of the public sphere, I want to say this is like 2005, asked of Richard Dawkins, and he framed it as the seduction versus confrontation question. And basically, and again, obviously Krauss became much more confrontational, in his public career. But basically the argument to Richard Dawkins was, hey, you're super confrontational to religious believers. Is that going to entrench them, or should we try and meet them where they are? Should we try and, be seductive? Should we, be friendly and conciliatory? And I got to tell you, man, like, I struggle with that question, right? Like, yeah, I hear you laugh. Go ahead, please. I want to know.
Yeah, the challenge I have, Andrew, is that sometimes when I talk about listening charitably and engaging people, the first reaction by those who hear that is to think that I'm asking everyone, including myself, to approach this well-funded, entitled religious steamroller as like Mr. Rogers might, just, oh, hey, neighbor, and or when I say that we need to be civil, that we shouldn't be strong, and that we shouldn't be passionate and forceful, and going out there using every legal avenue in our possession, every option that we can find to battle the injustices and the insanity and the mythology and the superstition and the abuses. And I very much feel I'm passionate about seeing the best ideas win. When I engage people out there, I find myself sort of doing a mental checklist. First of all, I ask, do they have a greater desire to believe than they have to know? Because that tells me whether or not I'm just going to be, bouncing things right off and nothing's going to matter. I know then that conversation over coffee is probably not going to be very productive. Are other people watching the ideas and positions presented? Because that may change whether or not I engage. Is this person engaging in any way in bad faith? If they are, I don't have time for you. I think sometimes the best response to the ridiculous is, in fact, ridicule. I think mockery and ridicule have a tremendous role to play, usually on the larger stage, not as much one-on-one, person-to-person. I don't go up to someone and be like, it's Santa Claus for adults, whenever we're talking over a beer. But it does, that stuff does work when people they don't feel attacked one-on-one, but they're sort of watching more from the periphery on the grander stage. And so it is situational, but I do find that whenever we are out there in the ether, in the social media ether, that we tend to assume bad faith or an uncharitable person or perhaps even a villain before we've actually attempted the conversation. And that's when I start to lament a little bit the death of discourse in the information age.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I just did a radio show with a right-wing guy who is a climate change denialist, is an Alex Jones listener,
Wow.
was as big a troglodyte as you could possibly imagine. But I listened to his show, and he tries to have on. He didn't have a lot of liberal guys on his show, and what I could say, like when you do appearances, right? Like I promoted the appearance, and so I had 25,000 people who were saying, "Oh, this is great," What I said to the folks who criticized him was, hey, look, this is a guy who believes the exact opposite of what I believe. And he gave me long blocks of time to explain my view and engaged with that. And like, did he do a Gish Gallop? And sure, right? Is he wrong? Of course he's wrong. But you can't ask for better treatment. He didn't cut me off. He didn't do the Sean Hannity, like I get 6 seconds out and he picks a word and then drills down. And all of a sudden I'm left going, are you going to let me talk? Like, he gave me a block of time to talk. I made my points. He listened. He engaged in good faith. In my view, you can't ask for more than that.
If they ask Aaron Raw to go debate evolution and they ask him to go to Prestonwood Baptist, well, hell, Christopher Hitchens went to Prestonwood Baptist mega church, I believe I think it's in Dallas. I mean, massive church. And yet he walked right in goodwill, and he, essentially challenged everything those people think and believe, and did so respectfully. But no one could ever say that Hitch was anything but strong. I mean, he just went in and just gave it to him. You and I exist. We live in this sort of weird world of imperfect solutions. Like there's no magic bullet for how we're going to approach the worst people. We simply try to do our best not to surrender the high ground while also doing battle against bad ideas and bad people, and do our best at the end of the day to never become them.
Can I tell you a quick story? I know,
please. Yeah.
All right. So, okay, this was Thanksgiving 2016, right? So this is 3 weeks after Donald Trump has won the U.S. presidential election, and a lot of folks are in shock, right? And I am getting ready to celebrate Thanksgiving. It is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and so Thanksgiving is a big get together, and my parents are coming up, my sister is coming over, and I'm outside in the backyard smoking a turkey on my ceramic smoke. I have a big green egg, if you know those things, right? And the turkey's got to go out the night before because it cooks low and slow and it gets all the smoke in it and it's delicious, right? And it's like 8 p.m. on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and I'm out there and I've got my phone in my pocket and my hand is up the cavity of the turkey, right? Like, as I'm repositioning it on the grill, right? Like, I am coated in turkey slime, right? And all of a sudden my phone is buzzing, and it's not just buzzing once. It's not just buzzing twice. Like, it won't stop. It is buzzing like I have turned on a massager in my pocket, right? So I'm like, all right, well, that's it. I got to stop lighting the grill. I got to put the turkey down. I got to go in. I got to wash my hands off. I got to figure out what the hell is going on my phone. And so I do all that, and I open it up, and I have 496 messages because Jill Stein has announced that she is pursuing recounts in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and that those recounts are going to prove that there was fraud and that Hillary Clinton, in fact, won those 3 states, and she's going to be president and not Donald Trump. And again, remember, November 2016, this is before Trump took office. And I'm looking at, and the 496 messages are all variations on the same question. And that question is, hey, Andrew, is this correct? Right? And as I'm reading and flipping, and you look at it, and obviously it's not correct, right? Like it is preposterous. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand the principle of standing, right? Which is that our courts don't render advisory opinions. Like, you can't go to the court and be like, hey, Supreme Court, what do you think about X? Like, you have to go, the reason every major Supreme Court decision has come up with somebody that has an interest in the outcome is because of a doctrine called standing, right? So our courts don't issue advisory opinions. They only rule on live cases or controversy. And so Jill Stein, at 1% in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, has no standing to request a recount when the end of the recount is going to be she's going to have 1% in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Right? There's nothing even close to expressing an interest. So I went on social media and I said, hey, lots of people are asking about this, but this is nonsense. Don't worry about it. And then my pocket started going off again. And what happened was a listener to the show who was a paralegal was in a Facebook group called Lawyers on the Left. It had 30,000 people on it. And she had messaged me to say, hey, I'm a part of this group, and I posted the thing you posted that said this is nonsense. And everybody in this group has said, oh, well, are you a lawyer? And I had to say no, because I'm just a paralegal. And so they've disregarded my opinion. Can I add you to the group? Will you come in and share this? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Why not? And so I went in and I shared my opinion based on the Wisconsin statute that requires you to have standing. And I said, look, we're all lawyers here. You know she doesn't have standing. Why are you even talking about giving money to Jill Stein for this? And an hour later, the administrator of this group, 30,000 people on Facebook, all lawyers, or not all lawyers, but mostly lawyers, wrote back to my first post and said, well, Andrew, you know as well as I do, you can never predict what a judge will do. So this is a terrible outcome, and I view this kind of like a lottery ticket. And if it pays off, Donald Trump is no longer president, so I'm going to get money. And then I wrote back and I said the following, which was the last thing I ever said on this group. I said, oh, you see, there's the difference between you and I. I wouldn't advise you to play the lottery either. And then I got banned and blocked and kicked from the Lawyers on the Left Facebook group. But yeah, like it was clear, total nonsense being used to raise money. And I looked and I give a speech on this. Jill Stein, in her entire 2-year presidential campaign, raised $3.5 million. When she announced this fundraiser to support recounts, in 2 weeks, she raised $7 million. Wow. And she raised that on the backs of scared liberals, on people I know and I've met with who said, dude, I live in Wisconsin. Nate Silver had this as a deep blue state. Like, I stayed home because I didn't like Hillary Clinton. I thought she was going to get us nowhere, but I never thought we was going to have Donald Trump as president. And those were the people who all of a sudden had that moment of like, oh no, what do we do now? And they gave her money and she pocketed the money. And it's just, that's the horrifying moment. That, like, to me, when you ask, so I warned you it was going to be a long story and kind of bringing it all back around, right? Like, when I think, why do we need to have elevated discourse? Like, that's why we need to have elevated discourse, because otherwise you're going to take somebody who is preying on your political sympathies, your personal sympathies, your philosophical sympathies, and you're going to give that person money and they're going to rob you of your money.
Let's talk in this final segment in just a moment. I'm having a little bit of an inner monologue, a little bit of a war within myself, because I'm like, you know, Andrew's a buddy. I mean, if we were talking over beer, would I ask him about the Russian P tape, or would I just skip over that altogether? I don't know. I'm going to have to think about it. Here, I will be right back, and then we're going to talk over one final segment about the church-state line and what you and I can do to help protect it here. In
so we are not talking about the Russian P tape in the next segment. I just want to be clear. Okay, good.
Okay, I'll be right back. Hang on. True story. I'm about to purchase my third Casper mattress. You want to know why? Because the pillow top mattress I bought a while back for the second guest room ain't nearly as comfortable as the Casper mattresses in the rest of the house. So I gave the pillow top away, and I'm going to get a queen-size Casper to replace it. The original Casper combines multiple supportive memory foams for a quality sleep surface. It has just the right amount of sink and bounce. It feels so good. It has a breathable design that helps you sleep cool. It regulates your body temperature throughout the night. Casper actually has 2 other mattresses as well, the Wave and the Essential. The Wave has this patent-pending premium support system that mirrors the natural shape of the body. The Essential has a streamlined design and a streamlined price that won't keep you up at night. I love the Casper pillows. The pillows. You know how hard it is to find the right pillow? Casper products are delivered right to your door, free shipping and returns in the United States and Canada. And you can be totally sure of your purchase with Casper's 100-night risk-free Sleep On It trial. Right now, get $50 towards select mattresses by visiting casper.com/thethinkingatheist. And then use the promo code Thinking Atheist at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Get your $50 off right now at casper.com/thethinkingatheist. Promo code Thinking Atheist. You know, it's amazing the stuff that radio hosts say to each other when no one else is looking. Andrew Torrez, co-host of the Opening Arguments podcast, has been kind enough to have a very candid conversation. And it's, you know, what I appreciate about you is you take very complex legal language and some very intricate situations. And you're a good storyteller. You're good at making those palatable for those of us who don't play in the sandbox. You know, is it designed to be overwhelming? I mean, Jesus, we look around and we just have a hard time processing the complexity of the mechanism that is American politics, right?
You know, some of it is, right? And some of it is job security. So it's in lawyers' interest to make you think that the law is a bunch of magic words in Latin that you have to say in the right order or else the spell doesn't work, right? Like, and because if you start to realize that there's a lot of common sense involved, then all of a sudden maybe you're not hiring the lawyer anymore. So, you know, there's a little bit of self-interest in there. One of the things I do on my show that it's become a beloved recurring segment is every week we do, my co-host Thomas Smith, we do a segment called Thomas Takes the Bar Exam. And what I do is I read, we're 85 questions in. I read him a bar exam prep question, right? The exam that actual lawyers take to be admitted to practice law. And Thomas is an ex-accountant. He's a podcast guy, right? Like he's got no legal background other than doing the show. And he's over 55% in taking these questions, where they're multiple choice. You got A, B, C, D. So your blind chance would be 25%, right? So he's better than twice what random chance would suggest. And the reason I do the segment is because I keep trying to drive home the lesson that there's some segments, right? There's some aspect of the law that is left over from 13th century Saxony, and you have to say, like, witnesseth the party of the first part does hereby convey to the party of the second part in fee simple. I get it, right? But 80% of the law, a good chunk, is governed by common sense. And the number of cases that I've had to do where I've gone into court and the other side has said, this doesn't seem fair. I don't have a case, I don't have a law, I don't have a statute, but this doesn't seem fair. And the judge or the appellate court has looked at me and their response is not, well, Andrew, you know, tell him why, you know, he gets to go pound sand. The response is, counselor, what's your response to that? Why is this fair? Why do we care? And I've had to deal with that, right? And it's kind of led to this belief, like it's why the Trump administration is so hard for me, right? Because I'm an American lawyer, like I love this country, like this is where I've chosen to practice law. And there's this sort of fundamental belief of inherent in the system, built in, is this notion that things are fair, the notion that things are comprehensible from the outside. Like you don't have to pay the priest to translate it from Latin. And that's why I try and do the show.
I mean, I know we all want to engage somehow, right? We want to find a way to participate in the process, to see our candidate win, our values win. When I look at Donald Trump, Andrew, I feel likely, like you do, I think this is an indictment of us. This is, I can't believe I'm quoting Kevin Costner, but he happened to, because I mean, he's been in like 4 good movies and he's a punchline for a lot of jokes, but I saw him on some soundbite.
Bull Durham is one of the all-time classics.
Bull Durham is a classic. I still have a soft spot for Field of Dreams, blah, blah, blah. But he said, in relation to the United States of America, he says, I don't recognize us right now. And that one sentence actually really, I thought he articulated the frustration that I feel. I think, you know, I don't recognize us right now. And I feel a sense of discouragement and despair. So, I mean, you tell me, is there any reason to be optimistic as we move into the last half of 2018?
Let me answer that with no, then yes. Right? Here's the no. One of the debates that lawyers enter into is a debate over the intentions of the founding fathers. In engaging in that, I found myself reading the Federalist Papers and reading the founding documents of our country. And Seth, let me tell you, if you read these documents, it will break your heart, right? It is things like explaining the justification. I think it's Federalist 75. Don't quote me on this. I didn't come, prepared with this document to the show, in which Alexander Hamilton is explaining why we have an electoral college. And he says, look, like all of these mechanisms are in place to make sure that a popular demagogue who's going to sell out the United States to a hostile foreign power couldn't possibly become our president. And you look at that and you're struck with this like overwhelming sense of naivete. This is one of the things I say to Trump supporters all the time is, our founding fathers anticipate, if you're with me on the left, right? Like our founding fathers anticipated hardcore partisans, right? Anticipated political disagreements at the core of what we think of as our nation's principles. What they didn't anticipate was somebody with no political ambition whatsoever, whose sole purpose in being president is to enrich himself, his family, and his immediate circle of cronies. They did not anticipate Donald Trump. And I look at it and I go, our institutions, the rule of law, everything that here is the reason it has power is because we believe that it has power. And if you stop believing that has power, if your view as president, as Donald Trump's view is, well, the law says X, but I'm not going to do that, then you are not left with a judicial remedy. You are left with a political remedy. You are left with the remedy of impeachment. And that is in the hands of a House of Representatives that is controlled right now by the Republicans. So that's depressing.
Would you support, this measure? I want you to come back to the last half, but as people after the Russia thing, as he sort of threw America under the bus and then changed the language and said he misspoke, blah, blah, blah. But are we getting to the point now where the word impeachment is on the table?
Here's the answer to that from a legal perspective, right? So from a legal perspective, what constitutes the president may be impeached for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the standard in the Constitution. And when you say, well, what's a high crime or misdemeanor? The answer is whatever the House of Representatives thinks is a high crime or misdemeanor. Bill Clinton was impeached. Right. He was acquitted in the Senate. It requires a 2/3 vote to convict in the Senate. But he was impeached. And the standard of impeachment for Bill Clinton was lying under oath about consensual sexual activity in the course of an extramarital affair. And so you can take whatever view you want on whether you would vote to convict, but the standard for voting to impeach is the standard that was put into place by the Republican Congress in 1998, lying under oath. By that standard, Donald Trump has been guilty a dozen times, right? Like we are not waiting. It should not require. The gold standard of what I say, right, is the peak of Yodel Mountain. Like when that little yodeling dude goes over the cliff is Donald Trump holding the comic book style sack of money with the dollar sign on it while shaking hands with Vladimir Putin, right? Like, yeah, at that point, everybody's on board. It shouldn't require the sack of gold with the dollar sign on it, right? Like there is sufficient criminal activity. The question is, how much have the American people been beaten down, right? Like how much is just the daily drumbeat of, the shirts and skins like, well, no, it's this, no, it's this, no, it's this, no, it's this. How much is that beaten down the average person to the point where like they don't know how to process anymore? And I don't know, right? Like
I see the word distraction thrown out there. You know, when people talk about this or that or the latest tweet. Many people ascribe agency behind it, and they say, well, actually, this is done on purpose to keep you from focusing on the Mueller investigation. Or the reason he did this is to try to purposefully keep you off base so that you're not focusing over here on this. Do you think there's any truth to that? What's your gut?
Yeah. So let me give you a really clear example of where that was put into place, right? That was put into place with the term fake news. Right after the election, the term fake news was employed by the center left, by CNN, by MSNBC, to describe not what Fox News was doing, right? Fox News is engaged in propaganda, right? But to describe InfoWars, to describe a situation that is political where the key fact in evidence has been fabricated, and you have no way of knowing that if you only look to the source itself. Within 3 months, the Trump administration had co-opted the phrase fake news and was deliberately using that phrase against CNN. And that's terrifying. Right. And to me, like that, you can't chalk that up to an accident, right? You have to chalk that up to deliberate strategy of taking the argument on the other side and trying to make it. I coach high school debate. Right? My son is a ninth grader, about to enter 10th grade of high school. And so in debate, one of the things that you do when the other side has an argument that you can't beat is you throw a couple of arguments against it, and then you say, oh, well, it's all, he says X, I say not X, so it's all a wash. You can't vote on that, right? You sort of mitigate out the argument by trying to muddy the waters. And I don't see any way to interpret what they did other than muddying the waters on the fact that you have an administration that thrives on propaganda not based on fact. That's terrifying.
Back to the question of yes or no, should we be optimistic? I got the no. So before I jump off the second story balcony here, tell me a yes. Tell me a reason to be optimistic.
A bunch of reasons for yes, right? So let me lay the groundwork. Number one, you always have to continue to fight because the other side is fighting. And, one of the things that I say is fighting, holding action sucks, but it doesn't suck as much as losing. And so you have to, when people will say, how can we get a liberal majority on the Supreme Court? Like you can't, right? Like the answer to that is you cannot until 2021 and President Elizabeth Warren or whoever it is, right? But does that mean you should roll over and not have a reasonable inquiry about Brett Kavanaugh? I don't think that's the case. So yes, you recalibrate the thought process and say, we need to figure out how to make this the least worst instead of how to score points. And that's tough. I get it that that's difficult. I'm a baseball guy, right? So think about it like the other team's up and you're down by 3 runs. Do you just throw the guy out there who's just going to start throwing meatballs so you're down by 11 runs? Like, no, like 3 runs. You can come back from 3 runs. So that's the first sort of metaphor. The second is we know that midterm elections, that off-year elections are decided by voter turnout. And it is possible to make your voice heard disproportionately because the turnout rates are roughly half of what they are in presidential elections. And you can do that, right? Like you can stay energetic and stay involved. And that's why so much of my dialogue and the wandering down Jill Stein lane is designed to the people who are dissatisfied with, this Democratic candidate who's a former Goldman Sachs executive, or, this Democratic candidate who doesn't support a $15 minimum wage. Like I get it, and fight like hell in the primaries to get the candidate you want. But when you get to the general election, stay enthusiastic and stay involved and remember the goal. And, and if we look at the demographics on the special elections that have happened since Trump has taken office, they show an enormous backlash against Trump, an enormous swing towards the Democratic Party. But you got to keep that up.
How do people get engaged to affect these sort of positive changes, to be able to be a part of the solution?
Yeah. 2 things. I talked about this on an episode of my show. Number one, get engaged at the state level. because states are free to have constitutional provisions, to have state Supreme Courts, to have state statutes that sit on top of the federal protections. And so if you're looking at an administration that is hostile to LGBTQ rights, which is true, if you're looking at a judiciary that may be conservative for the next 30 years, which is true, then make that change on the state level and sit on top of those rights. Like say, the federal government and the federal Constitution may protect X, but the Oklahoma Constitution protects X plus this. And so, number one, it brings the importance of being active at the local level. Really, it makes that proposition more acute. And number two, go out and do not let yourself get demoralized by a Democratic candidate that you may disagree with on 2 or 3 issues that you really care about versus the consequence of staying home where you elect somebody who's hostile on every issue you care about.
Andrew Torrez, co-host of the Opening Arguments podcast, which of course I will link in the description box. You're sure you don't want to talk about the Russian P tape? I mean, I'm just going to give you one last shot at it before we call it a show. I don't know why it fascinates me. I just have this, and I'm not expecting you to comment, but when you have the impression that Putin has something on him, when you see the deference that Trump gives to Putin, I just can't help but wonder if there is leverage in place, whether it's a tape from a hotel room or whether it's a business deal with millions, perhaps billions of dollars or something else. It's one of those things that I keep waiting for that to come out in the wash.
I don't know the answer to that. So, A, you've known me for a while, and your listeners are getting a sense from this conversation. I'm not a conspiracy theory-minded guy.
Yeah, we don't try to knee-jerk into the most salacious scenario. Yeah.
There's a thing to be explained for somebody who illustrates the classic, bad alpha male behavior everywhere he goes, right? That Donald Trump makes people wait before they get an audience with him. He does that,
including the Queen.
Yeah, right.
Including the Queen of England.
Yeah. He's late to his meetings as part of a one-upmanship, right? He does that power handshake. He sits to your left, all of it's out of a bad, Zig Ziglar book, right? It's just ridiculous. And you watch his level of deference with a hostile foreign dictator, Vladimir Putin, and you see him rolling over. You and I are both dog guys, right? I have a new 11-week-old Bernese mountain dog here in my house. I'm surprised he hasn't barked during it. The exact opposite of rat dog.
Rolls over and submits, right? He rolls over and submits.
On his back, all 4 limbs in the air, belly exposed. And you're looking at that going, what explains that, right? Here's somebody who is the ultimate.
What's he got? Yeah.
And you match that against something. And this was, it's not, I'm trying to figure out what Alan Dershowitz is doing these days because it's disturbing and weird. But Alan Dershowitz is my criminal law professor and somebody who had a really formative effect on me when I was in law school. And Dershowitz used to say, as part of his crim law course, he said, one of the things I have learned from individuals who've been the subject of blackmail is that you cannot blackmail someone who is without shame. And Alan Dershowitz represented Larry Flynt, the publisher of Hustler magazine, and he used to deal with efforts to blackmail Larry Flynt in the 1970s and 1980s. And he said, they went nowhere because you can't blackmail somebody who is a smut peddler for a living, right? What are you going to do? And that's kind of the counterpoint of Donald Trump. Here is somebody who is utterly without shame. How could you blackmail someone who proudly boasts on videotape the audio is recorded of, the Access Hollywood, just go up to, prepubescent girls and how can that person be blackmailed? And you can come to one of 2 conclusions. You can come to the conclusion of, okay, so this is not a viable theory, or you can come with, boy, this must be even worse than we could possibly imagine.
And I have to say, this is all conjecture. We're just chatting. We're just chatting. But I do find it a point of fascination because if something does come out at some point, I'd be curious to watch the evangelicals then try to wrap their excuses around this. And I mean, I'm not convinced they won't find some sort of equivocation or rationalization after seeing what's happened over the past several years. I'm more discouraged than I've been in a long time.
I want to bring you on my show, and I want to ask you the question, because this is fascinating how I mean, it's now been a year and a half, but it was 6 months in where the message got disseminated out all the way from the top down to the average evangelical voter of, well, Donald Trump is the new Cyrus and Jesus works through flawed rulers to effectuate his goal. And like, how in the world does that happen?
How do you get Franklin Graham to endorse you?
Oh my gosh.
If you're going after women who are not your wife in the most overt predatory way. I look at these people. Who was it? Forgive me. I think he was a former head of the Republican National Committee. His name escapes me. Who said, "You now have surrendered the right to ever tell me how to live my life in any moral way." I forget his name off the top of my head, but he was on a news show and he's like, "Whoever you people are, you have now forfeited the right to ever tell me how I should live my life in a moral way." And he was absolutely right. They've long surrendered the high ground.
Yeah, I think that was that Steve Schmidt.
I got to look this up. Former chairman. I'm gonna pull an Andrew Torrez and just while you're here.
Research is your friend.
Michael Steele.
Oh,
Maryland.
I'm a Maryland guy. So there you go.
And so he said, all of you who are evangelicals who've forgiven Trump, he said, quote, "They're giving up all the moral authority here. I have a very simple admonition at this point. Just shut the hell up and don't ever preach to me about anything ever again. I don't want to hear it." And of course, I'm jumping out of my chair and giving you the standing ovation. Andrew Torrez, it's an honor to have you on this broadcast. It's an honor to be able to know you as a friend. I'm so much a fan and admirer of your work over at Opening Arguments. And we'll send some more people over there. And if there's ever anything we can do for you, you just have your people call our people and we'll do the thing. Okay?
Seth, I didn't get a chance to say this, but your show is absolutely was one of my entrees into the atheist community and, sort of this crazy area in which we find ourselves. I love what you're doing. I started off with the story of Susie, way back on YouTube.
Wow, you're a veteran.
I love what you're doing. I love the show, and I'm super excited to have done this. If you told me you wanted to go another 6 hours, man, I would stay up into the middle of the night because this is a lot of fun, man.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.